Sometimes salvation and second chances arrive in the dead of winter, when hope has frozen as solid as the ground beneath your feet. Montana, 1982. The knock came just after sunset. Margaret Sullivan chambered around in her Winchester Model 70, the familiar action steadying her trembling hands. At 58, she'd grown accustomed to solitude on this failing ranch, but not to the drifters who occasionally came looking for easy prey. A widow alone on 180 acres. Last spring, two men claiming to be bank assessors had tried to break in. They'd left with buckshot in their truck's tailgate. 7 years a widow, her husband's Cessna crash still haunted her dreams. Two sons gone to the cities, one to Seattle tech firms, the other to Minneapolis banking, neither interested in dirt under their fingernails or calluses on their palms. Half her land seized by First Montana Bank last spring, the remaining acres barely keeping her alive. She wasn't expecting visitors, not in February, not during the worst blizzard to hit Gallatin County in decades. The pounding came again, more urgent. Margaret positioned herself at the window's edge, rifle ready. Through swirling snow, she caught the outline of a man. Something in his posture, military straight despite the storm, made her pause. Then she saw the bundle in his arms. When she cracked open that door, her breath caught. A tall man stood in the blizzard, early 40s, broad-shouldered. His Ford F-150, 75 by the distinctive grille, was parked at an odd angle near her barn, hood open to the elements. In his arms, a boy no older than 10 slept against his chest, face flushed and alarming red. "Ma'am," the man said, voice rough but controlled. "Name's Frank Townsend. Fuel pump gave out a mile back. Pushed the truck here when I saw your lights." He shifted the boy slightly. "My son's running a fever of 103. We just need somewhere warm for the night. I can pay or work. Whatever you need." Margaret studied his face in the lamplight. No desperation in those eyes, just determination and bone-deep fatigue. The gold band on his left hand caught the light. The boy whimpered softly. "The last men who came to my door uninvited were casing the place to rob it," she said bluntly, keeping the rifle visible. Not a flicker of offense crossed his face. "Smart to be cautious. I'd do the same." He reached slowly into his coat pocket with his free hand, producing a military ID. "Lieutenant Commander, U.S. Navy, retired now. But if you need to hold on to this until morning—" "Get the boy inside," she said, lowering the rifle and stepping back. "Temperature's dropping by the minute." "Jason," Frank explained as Margaret placed a cool cloth on the boy's forehead. They'd settled him on her couch, wrapped in quilts her mother had made decades ago. "Started coughing yesterday morning. By afternoon, he was burning up." Margaret's nurse's training kicked in automatically. 20 years in Army hospitals hadn't faded from muscle memory. She checked the boy's throat, ears, and breathing. "Pneumonia, most likely. I've got antibiotics in my kit." She caught Frank's questioning look. "Ex-Army nurse, captain, MASH units and stateside hospitals." "Navy," he replied with a nod of recognition. "Served from 62 to 74. Gulf operations, mostly." She administered medicine to the half-conscious boy, then turned to Frank. "When did you last eat? There's coffee on the stove and stew in the pot." Frank's hands, calloused, capable, wrapped around the offered mug. "We were heading to Idaho. My uncle left me some money. Thought we'd start fresh." He took a long drink. "Been on the road 3 days." Margaret nodded, not asking the obvious questions. The gold band told part of the story. The careful way he'd packed his son's bag, clothes folded with military precision, extra medicine tucked in side pockets, told another. "This storm's not breaking until morning," she said. "Spare rooms down the hall." "Thank you, ma'am. I'll make it right. That barn door looks like it's about to give way in this wind. First thing tomorrow, I'll secure it properly." Margaret almost refused, pride being the last possession no bank could seize, but practicality won out. Get some rest, Commander. Your boy needs you strong. Jason's fever broke before dawn. Margaret found Frank outside at first light, already repairing her barn door. The wind had died, but snow lay 3 feet deep across the property. He worked with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd learned to make every movement count. Navy teach you carpentry? She asked, offering coffee. He hammered the last nail home before answering. Engineering, actually. Worked on diesel engines mostly, but a ship's a closed system. You learn to fix everything or you sink. He nodded toward her equipment yard. That John Deere 4020 back there. 72 model, right? Sitting idle a while? My husband's pride and joy. Been dead in the water since the fuel injection system gave out last spring. Can't afford the parts. Frank wiped his hands on a rag. Mind if I take a look? Might not be as bad as you think. By noon, he had the tractor's engine disassembled on a tarp, methodically cleaning parts and replacing a clogged fuel filter with material he'd salvaged from his truck's repair kit. His hands moved with practiced confidence. No wasted motion. Margaret watched from the doorway, remembering John's frustration with the machine. Her husband had been a good man, a skilled pilot, but mechanical things had confounded him. Jason appeared beside her. Color returned to his cheeks. Is he fixing it? The boy asked, voice still raspy. Seems to be, Margaret replied. Pa can fix anything, Jason said with quiet pride. In the Navy, he fixed submarines when nobody else could figure out what was wrong. Margaret glanced at the boy, then back at Frank, who was focused entirely on the fuel line he was cleaning. Submarines weren't the same as diesel engines on surface ships. Another piece of the puzzle shifted into place. She made proper lunch. Venison stew she'd been saving, not the thin broth she usually subsisted on. As they ate, Frank asked careful questions about the farm. How many acres, what crops, what equipment still worked. John's life insurance kept things going for a few years, Margaret explained. Then inflation hit. Equipment broke down. Banks breathing down my neck for $15,000 by June. They'll take the rest if I can't pay. Land's still good, though, Frank observed. Soil looks rich. With working equipment and the right crop rotation, I'm too old and too broke to work it properly, Margaret said flatly. Frank studied her, then glanced at his son, who was examining a collection of field guides on her bookshelf. Jason, why don't you go check on my toolbox in the shed? Make sure I didn't leave anything outside that could rust. When the boy had gone, Frank leaned forward. Mrs. Sullivan, I'm going to be direct. I've got $20,000 from my uncle's estate. I was heading to Idaho to buy a small repair shop, but he gestured outside. This land has potential. That money could plant a spring wheat crop, fix what needs fixing, and keep the bank at bay. He looked her in the eye. I'm proposing a partnership. My capital and labor, your land and experience. 50-50 split. Margaret's eyes narrowed. Why would you risk that on a stranger in a failing farm? Because I've spent 2 years drifting since Sarah died, and I'm tired of Jason not having roots. Frank's voice remained steady, but his knuckles whitened around his coffee mug. Because I watched you treat my son before you knew anything about us, and because this morning I saw a Winchester that's been maintained perfectly despite everything else falling apart. Tells me you're someone who holds on to what matters. The tractor engine roared to life outside before she could answer. Jason came running in, face lit with excitement. Pa, I turned the key like you showed me and it worked. Frank's eyes never left Margaret's. The question hung between them. Before she could respond, tires crunched on the gravel drive. Through the window, she spotted Richard Coleman's gleaming Cadillac, First Montana Bank's most predatory loan officer. Well, she said grimly, here comes the vulture to check if we're dead yet. Coleman oozed insincerity as he settled his considerable bulk at Margaret's kitchen table, brushing snow from his expensive camel hair coat. Just checking on you after the storm, Mrs. Sullivan, he said, eyes darting to Frank with undisguised suspicion. And who might this be? Frank Townsend. Frank extended his hand. Coleman took it reluctantly. I'm helping Mrs. Sullivan get the spring planting ready. Coleman's eyebrows rose. Is that so? Well, I'm afraid that might be premature. Given the condition of this property, we're considering accelerating the foreclosure timeline. Unless Mrs. Sullivan can make a substantial payment immediately, the loan agreement gives her until June 15th, Frank said quietly. Coleman's smile tightened. You a lawyer, Mr. Townsend? Just someone who believes in honoring agreements, Frank replied, holding Coleman's gaze until the banker looked away. Coleman turned to Margaret. I don't know what kind of drifter you've let into your home, but I suggest you reconsider. The bank is being more than generous already. Margaret found her voice. Mr. Townsend is my new business partner. We'll have your payment by the deadline. The actual deadline. After Coleman left, muttering threats about reviewing loan terms, Margaret turned to Frank. You stood your ground. Most people around here are too intimidated by the bank to do that. Frank shrugged. Bullies are the same everywhere. Military, banks, schoolyards. He met her gaze. I meant what I said about the partnership. And I meant what I said about payment by June, Margaret replied. So I guess we'd better get to work. Something flashed in Frank's eyes. Relief, perhaps, or respect. He nodded once. Yes, ma'am. As he headed outside to continue repairs, Margaret noticed a small leather notebook that had fallen from his jacket. She picked it up, intending to return it, when a folded document slipped out. Legal letterhead from the Department of the Navy. Her eyes caught the words Judge Advocate General's Corps and Lieutenant Commander Francis Townsend. The pieces suddenly aligned. The precise language when confronting Coleman, the way he'd assessed her loan situation, the submarine repair Jason had mentioned. Margaret slipped the document back into the notebook and set it on the table. Another piece of Frank Townsend to consider. By April, the property was transforming. Frank had repaired the irrigation system, mended fences, and prepared 30 acres for spring wheat. The old barn stood straighter, its roof no longer leaking. More surprising were the visitors, neighboring farmers who'd heard about Frank's mechanical skills and legal knowledge, bringing equipment to fix and questions about their own bank troubles. Jason had started at the local school, bringing home books and stories each afternoon. The boy had taken to following Margaret around the kitchen garden, absorbing her knowledge of plants with remarkable retention. This one stops bleeding? He asked, pointing to yarrow. That's right, Margaret replied, impressed. The soldiers called it battlefield herb in Korea. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching Jason chase fireflies across the yard, Frank brought up the future. Coleman will be back. Even with the money I've put in, we're cutting it close with the bank. Margaret nodded. This land's been in my family for 3 generations. John and I thought our boys would want it someday. My father worked the same assembly line for 40 years, Frank said. All I wanted was to escape that life. And I did, college, law school, the Navy. Then Sarah got sick. He watched his son's carefree movements. I realized all that ambition didn't mean much without roots. You never told me you were JAG, Margaret said quietly. Frank turned to her, surprise clear on his face. Your notebook fell open. I saw the letterhead. She held his gaze. You let me believe you were just an engineer. I was both, he admitted. Started in engineering, then law school at night, JAG Corps after that. He looked down at his calloused hands. After Sarah died of cancer, I couldn't stand offices anymore, arguing technicalities while real people suffered. I went back to what I knew before law school, fixing things, working with my hands. Why keep it secret? Would it have mattered that first night? Would you have trusted me more or less? Margaret considered this. I don't like secrets between partners. No more secrets, Frank agreed. I promise. A sudden crack of thunder broke the moment. Storm clouds rolled in from the west, dark and ominous. "That doesn't look good," Margaret said, her instincts from decades of farming kicking in. "Spring storms can flood the lower fields." Frank was already on his feet. "I'll check the drainage ditches." "Jason, inside, buddy. Storm's coming." The storm raged for 3 days. The creek that bordered the property swelled beyond its banks, threatening the newly planted fields. Frank and Margaret worked side by side in the downpour, digging emergency channels to redirect the water. On the second night, Jason slipped out to help, falling and cutting his arm deeply on exposed metal from an old fence. Blood poured from the wound, bright red in the flashlight beam. "Pressure point," Margaret commanded, pressing her thumb hard against the brachial artery while Frank carried Jason to the house. Inside, she worked with the steady hands of a combat nurse, cleaning and suturing the wound while Frank paced, white-faced. "He should be in bed, not out in a storm," Margaret said, tying off the last stitch. "He wants to help." Frank's voice was tight with fear and exhaustion. "He feels like this is home." "Is it?" Margaret asked, the question weighted with more than just concern for Jason. Frank's eyes met hers across his son's sleeping form. "I want it to be." Before she could respond, the phone rang. The rural emergency network. The Henderson farm upstream had suffered a major breach in their irrigation dam. A wall of water was heading downstream. They worked through the night, reinforcing berms, moving equipment to higher ground. By dawn, mud-covered and bone-weary, they surveyed their work as the floodwaters receded, leaving their wheat fields mostly intact. Frank put a hand on Margaret's shoulder. "We did it." She nodded, too tired for words, and leaned against him briefly before straightening. "Coffee. We need coffee." As they trudged back to the house, Richard Coleman's Cadillac appeared, somehow immaculate despite the muddy roads. "Perfect timing," Margaret muttered. Coleman emerged with a folder under his arm, looking almost pleased at the devastation around him. "Mrs. Sullivan, Mr. Townsend, I trust you weathered the storm?" His false concern didn't reach his eyes. "I've brought the final foreclosure notice. The bank requires payment in full within 30 days, or we'll be forced to seize the property." Frank, mud-streaked and exhausted, stepped forward. The terms were clear. Payment by June 15th. "The terms have been adjusted due to risk reassessment," Coleman smiled thinly. "This flood only confirms our concerns about this property's viability." "Is that so?" Frank's voice changed, taking on an authority that made Coleman blink. Lieutenant Commander Francis Townsend, Judge Advocate General's Corps, retired. "I've documented 5 separate violations of the Farm Credit Act in your dealings with this property, including failure to provide disaster relief extensions as required by federal law, like during a flood emergency that the governor declared yesterday." Coleman's smile vanished. "You told me you weren't a lawyer." "I told you I believe in honoring agreements." Frank reached into his muddy jacket and produced a business card. "My former commanding officer is now with the Federal Banking Commission. I spoke with him last week about predatory lending practices targeting vulnerable rural properties in this county." Coleman's face flushed red. "The bank has every right to follow the law," Frank finished. "We'll make our payment as scheduled. And if you try to force this property into premature foreclosure, I'll personally see that every farm you've seized under questionable circumstances gets reviewed by federal regulators." When Coleman's Cadillac had disappeared down the drive, Margaret turned to Frank, anger mixing with admiration. "You called your commanding officer?" "Last week," Frank admitted, "after I reviewed your loan documents and found the irregularities. I wanted a contingency plan." "Without telling me?" "I was going to. Today, actually." He ran a hand through his mud-caked hair. "I wanted to make sure we had ammunition before I raised your hopes." Margaret studied him. This man who'd come into her life during a blizzard and was now fighting battles she'd given up on. "No more moves without consulting me first. Clear?" Frank nodded, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. Crystal clear, Captain. Margaret's expression softened. Come inside, Commander. We both need sleep before the next battle. 6 months later, the wheat harvest exceeded expectations. Frank had modernized the irrigation system, and Margaret's knowledge of the land proved invaluable. The bank received its payment, with Coleman noticeably subdued during the transaction. Word spread about Frank's background. Other farmers began stopping by, seeking advice on bank dealings and contract reviews. He never charged for his help, but accepted payment in equipment loans and promises of future assistance. One October evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold and crimson, Margaret brought out a dusty bottle of whiskey John had saved for special occasions. Think this qualifies, she asked, pouring 2 fingers in each glass. Saving the farm? I'd say so. Frank took a sip, appreciating the smooth burn. Not just the farm, Margaret said quietly. Finding someone who understands what it means to start over. Frank studied her in the fading light. At 58, Margaret Sullivan was all angles and weathered grace, silver threading through dark hair she never bothered to dye. Her hands bore the same calluses as his, earned through work rather than idle pursuits. I've been thinking about next year's planting, he said carefully. If we rotate an alfalfa on the South 40, we could improve soil nitrogen for wheat the following season. Planning 2 years ahead. I am, Frank said, if that's all right with you. Margaret set down her glass. What exactly are you proposing, Frank? A permanent arrangement. He met her gaze steadily. Not a traditional marriage. We're both too practical for that. But a partnership, legal, agricultural, and personal. Jason needs stability. This land needs both of us. And He paused, searching for the right words. I need someone who sees me clearly and doesn't flinch. Before Margaret could respond, the phone rang. She answered, her expression shifting from annoyance to shock. Michael? Yes, it's me. She glanced at Frank. Yes, I heard you were coming for Thanksgiving. Yes, David told me you were both coming. What? No, I'm not selling the farm. In fact, she straightened her shoulders. In fact, I've taken on a partner, business and personal. Yes, that's right. His name is Frank Townsend, former Navy JAG. Yes, he'll be here for Thanksgiving too with his son. She hung up, hands slightly unsteady. My older son. First time he's called in 8 months. Family grapevine works fast, Frank observed. They're coming to inspect you, Margaret said, a hint of apology in her voice. To make sure you're not after the farm. Frank laughed softly. The farm they couldn't leave fast enough? They feel entitled to approve my decisions, Margaret said, frustration evident. Even when they want nothing to do with this place. Frank took her hand, his expression serious. Do you want me to leave before they arrive? Make it easier for you? Margaret stared at him, then shook her head slowly. No, this is our farm now, our home. She squeezed his hand. Our family, unconventional as it may be. 2 weeks later, they drove to the county courthouse and filed partnership papers, both for the farm and for themselves. No ceremony, no fuss. Just a practical solution for 2 practical people who'd found each other when they'd stopped looking. That evening, as snow began to fall, they stood together on the porch, Margaret, Frank, and Jason between them, watching the white blanket settle over fields that would sleep until spring, gathering strength for next year's harvest. Worth fighting for, Margaret said softly, echoing words Frank had spoken months earlier. Every single day, he agreed, his arm finding its way around her shoulders as naturally as if it had always belonged there. Jason looked up at them both, this family forged from loss and resilience, and smiled, the simple, perfect smile of a child who has found his way home. If this story of second chances and rebuilding life spoke to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had to start over when all doors seem closed? When did you find unexpected strength in yourself or others? Share your experience with our community. And remember, it's never too late to plant a new crop, fix what's broken, or create family from the pieces life has given you.